Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adam Savitt. I'm happy to welcome you back to the Center for Security Policy for our webinar series. Remember, we do this every Wednesday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. To check the schedule, go to securefreedom.org and check under the webinar tab. I'll also give you a preview of upcoming events at the end of today's broadcast. Today is our monthly China webinar entitled Ignoring the Uyghur Genocide, featuring our guest Sasha Gong and my center colleague, Michael Waller. Please note that you are in listen-only mode, but you can submit your text questions in the Q&A box on the GoToWebinar panel. I'll read as many questions as possible at the end of the program. This event is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/securefreedom, and at our website at securefreedom.org. With that, I'll hand it over to the Center's Senior Analyst for Strategy, Michael Waller.
Thanks, Adam. Good to have everybody here today on this webinar to talk about the Uyghur minority group in China and what's happening to it, and as a people, and what the Chinese government is doing, and why does it or does not matter to Americans. So we're here with a guest and a good friend of mine, Dr. Sasha Gong, who's a scholar and a journalist on China affairs, and she was also a political prisoner under the communists. So she has kept up on this and so many other issues in China, and it's great to have her here as our guest. So looking at the question, ignoring the, thank you, Sasha, but looking at the question of the Uyghur genocide and people ignoring it, part of the question is who's ignoring it or who has been ignoring it? Why has it been ignored? And one of the strange things is, since this is a Muslim minority, why are these so many Muslim dominant countries silent about it? Are they being paid, or do they even get it all, or is there what's the geopolitical thing behind it? So there's a whole lot of stuff we want to cover here that actually goes beyond Uyghurs. So Sasha, that's the opening question. What do you say?
Yeah, well, that was my question as well. Who's ignoring it? And for many years, I think the United States begin to pay attention to it just a few years ago. But that has been ongoing for a long time. It's something I want to probe deeper today. It's the communist policy towards its minorities. We are using the word genocide, but I think I would prefer more like oppression, because oppression is the prelude of genocide, of wiping out the entire nation, entire group. So we have to understand how it happened, why it happened, and I'm no expert on the Uyghurs, I have to say, but I myself, as a Cantonese, I actually have seen quite a lot of how the Chinese work towards their minority and what their policy, how they wipe out their culture and orders. So let's discuss that.
Sure. For starters, the Uyghurs are not unique in being repressed as an ethnic or national group within. It's a widespread issue among various ethnic groups in China.
It's a very widespread issue.
Tell us what. Yeah, so we can. I think we should get to that because it's so big and it covers so much of communist China now. But tell us, who are the Uyghurs as a nation? What makes them distinct from other peoples within the borders of present-day China? And what are the basic circumstances around their state of being today?
Yeah, the Uyghurs that live in Central Asia, part of China, what China calls Xinjiang in Chinese, it actually means new territory, because it was new territory to the Chinese. It was not old territory. And Qing Dynasty called that new territory. And when we are talking about 17th century, when you look at it, how many people are Uyghurs? That is a question, because a few years ago, I think in 2016 or something like that, I don't remember exactly. The Chinese embassy in France had a feature report out. They quoted the Chinese original numbers that there are 12 million Uyghurs. But the current Chinese official number, which when it's official, everybody had to use it, said only 11 million. So what happened to that 1 million? This should be in everybody's mind, because the Chinese embassy would not use that number unless they came from the Chinese official number. So now I actually searched the number. You could not find that missing 1 million people. So what we see in the past few years, what happened here is a few things we need to pay close attention to. Of course, the first one is the concentration camp. The Chinese call that re-education camp. That sort of camp exists in China from the very beginning of communism. They use that camp. Remember, it's not a jail sentence. It's a camp to re-educate you. So millions or even tens of millions of Chinese, including some of my family members, were sent to such camps to be re-educated. And that's a brainwashed entity. First thing, what we heard the report of there are 1 million Uyghurs in such camps, and that they're forced to enter the camps. So the Chinese government never denied it. The Chinese government said it's for their own good. So the second thing actually fewer people pay attention to is how many Uyghurs were assigned to work outside of the Xinjiang area within Chinese territory where some labor shortage happened or labor prices went so high. They organize, quote unquote, Uyghur people. They force Uyghur people to supply labor, labor forces to Chinese factories and to provinces far thousands of miles away from the Uyghur region. So in that way, they ease the tension, so-called, again, quote unquote, ease the tension of the Uyghur problem, which mainly focused on men or younger people. So they're sending Uyghur people away. Who knows that?
Is this an organized? Is this an organized transfer of large numbers of Uyghur men?
Systematically organized.
As cheap labor. So this can't happen without Communist Party approval or direction, right?
Oh, absolutely, because China still has this hukou system, which control people's travel, especially with this new pandemic thing. Now you need what they call health code to travel. You don't have it, you can't travel. Your travel has to be approved, especially now, especially Uyghurs. For I think it's starting from about 10 years ago, and many hotels or places, refuse to take in Uyghurs or Tibetans. So if you go to a hotel, you show your passport, internal passport, you show ID, it shows you're Uyghur, they would reject you. And I actually interviewed people on that, and I have people who lived in Washington, who own hotels, who can tell you, what they got. It's not only the Uyghurs, but also the Tibetans and the Hui people and other people who are deemed to be problematic by the Chinese Communist government. So you're saying that in China, every person there has an internal passport that's required for moving around the country, right? Oh yeah,
and that internal passport has their ethnicity on it?
Yes, actually, that burden on the Chinese people are, sort of intensified by the COVID-19. Now, I actually have people sending me that code. In many places in China, if you don't carry that, they call it security code or health code, whatever you call it, to prove they are not infected by COVID-19 or whatever, you can't travel. You can't even go on a bus. And that code has everything, has all your information. I give you one example. A couple of months ago, the Chinese found one case in one wet market, one case of COVID-19. in that morning, 13,000 people went to that wet market. Within 1 hour, the government located everyone, because without scanning your security code there, you can't even enter a market. And that's what, when the Uyghur people go out, they have to have that.
Sounds like what some people are recommending here for these health passports to track all your movements. But that's another subject. We can talk about that at another time. But let's get back to the Uyghurs for a second, because you'd said early on that there's that some are calling it a genocide, and there's a legal definition for that genocide, and it requires a certain policy action or a diplomatic action. And you said it might not be a genocide yet. It certainly is mass repression, but this is what leads up to genocide. Correct?
It's only, UN has a definition of genocide after the Second World War. So people are now debating whether or not genocide is the correct word to use. And personally, I said, I think we need a little more information, and the idea of people who are killed, who are arrested. But if you talk about physical genocide, but I would say the cultural genocide has been ongoing for a while, for decades. That's something we also need to pay very close attention to. Now the Chinese government are arguing, well, the people are there. We haven't killed them yet. Yeah. So, well,
but they're breeding them out, aren't they? They're breeding them out, right? There are these reports of these women who the men are taken away from the families, and you have others brought in, and there's sort of rape camps or some sort of activity to either destroy the morale or the integrity of the population, or even breed them out. What do you make of those reports?
Actually, lots of those reports have very good foundation. If you think of it, if you bring a very large group of young men out as laborers and mixing in with other nationality, well, intermarriage happen, other things happen, and if you're separating people from their family, you're limiting their the family size, whatever. Actually, the Chinese government has been doing that for ages, for all the, but in the past few years, they intensified their effort in Xinjiang and also in Tibet. So that's something we really need to pay attention to. Yeah.
Yeah, and this is not just an objective. This is a liquidation of an entire ethnic group. What's the end goal for the Communist Party? Why are they doing that?
Well, the way is the Communist Party, one thing the Communist Party hated most is independent thought, independent organizations. When we grow up, everybody have some anti-government thoughts, and that's natural. The government had a lot of trouble to control that, but they do control when people. Well, they do suppress people when they have their own organization, independence of government, their own belief, independence of the communist ideology, something like that. So if you look at the Uyghur people and Tibetan people, the Uyghur people, they have their own religion, they're Muslims. And especially since the 1980s, if you look at it, and a lot of Middle Eastern, including Wahhabi Islam, went into Xinjiang since from the 1980s. So the mosque, because there's a period of a little bit relaxation after the Cultural Revolution, the Muslim people re-established their mosques and their belief. So they organize differently, they believe in different things. And that itself is threat to communism. And if you look at it's not only the Islamic belief, and you also look at the Tibetan, the Buddhist, and the Hui people who are also Muslims. And look at this, the Chinese are doing to all of them.
And the Christians too.
Oh, of course. And the Christians are mostly Han people.
So back on the Uyghurs then, though, so you have the just sort of traditional Central Asian Muslim culture that was repressed by the communists, and then when communism relaxed in the 80s, there was a religious revival. But then you said the Wahhabis came in; these were Saudis or from Qatar to radicalize. Okay.
Oh yeah.
And is this what the communists refer to when they talk about?
The Chinese.
Is this what the communists refer to when they talk about terrorism? No, sorry, we keep running over each other. Go on. Go ahead.
The Chinese actually took advantage of this fact, and I don't know how many Uyghurs are Wahhabist. I, from what I know, the majority of them have nothing to do with it, but some have. So the Chinese took advantage of it, and the Chinese would say, "Hey, we have terrorism." So after September 11th, China, in the name of cooperation, actually worked with our State Department, worked with us to, in that way, America's also ignored the Uyghur problem for a long time. And the Chinese started their action to intensify the action. They started, they from the very beginning, but they intensified that action. After September 11, we are talking about the past 20 years. And what's also happening is that, since the problems that when people organize, when people start, they would continue. So if you look at Uyghur area, you see, people continue to organize in mass, and people continue to convert or believe in and convert into Muslim, into Islam, which gives him a very good sense of life and whatever. That's in the Chinese constitution. So after realizing that, the Chinese government intensified its action. So actually, I want to trace back a little bit on the subject. Is one thing I realized what happened. It's happening all over China now in all the minorities. But I worked for Radio Free Asia for a few years from the late 90s, and for a few years.
And that, just for our viewers, Radio Free Asia is to the communist countries in Asia the way Radio Free Europe was designed to send messages into the communist repressed areas in Europe.
Yeah, Radio Free Asia has a Uyghur service and has the Tibetan service. They still have it. The Uyghur service, Voice of America doesn't have it. Radio Free Asia is the only one with a Uyghur service. And I made friends with Tibetan and Uyghur people. Before that, I have a few Uyghur people from college, but they are all educated, right? So one thing they told me, which surprised me completely, was people of my age, people who, are supposed to attend high school or elementary school from the mid-1960s to late 1970s, could speak Uyghur or Tibetan, but could not write and read it. Some can read and they learn fast, but for 10 years in those regions, the Chinese forbid them to teach in their own language. Now it's happening. What we know is what happened a few weeks ago in Inner Mongolia. It's also the Chinese government ordered the Inner Mongolia schools to teach in Mandarin, not in Mongolian.
So let's explain this part for a little bit, because it's really important. So what we're seeing in East Turkestan, or the land of the Uyghur people in Xinjiang, is a gradual deterioration of passing from one generation to the next, their traditions, their language, ultimately their spoken language, right, and all of their culture. So it's the same we'd see in Tibet against the Buddhists, and then now we're seeing it in Inner Mongolia, which is a substantial part of northern China. So tell us about that. What's happening there?
Sorry, now we are seeing that in Hong Kong, and in Hong Kong they sought to use what they call standard teaching materials and the Mandarin to teach young people. The Hong Kong people always use, before this generation, it's always Cantonese and language. I'm Cantonese, so I'm sort of a local in Hong Kong. And the Chinese government is trying very hard to wipe out the culture. You can speak the language. It's a local dialect only considered. But if you don't read or write in your own language, you gradually lose the culture. First, you lose the high-end culture, no literature, and your culture itself became, the way is that the Communist Party push your culture back to a primitive stage.
It's funny. It's sort of like they're not teaching children in the United States how to write in cursive anymore. So a lot of younger adults or teenagers can't even read cursive in English, let alone write it. So it's a weird parallel there. But so let's get back to this. So you've got a whole the culture's being wiped out. But this is not just communist. I mean, the Soviets had Russification on the one hand, even under the Tsars, but under communism, they were repressing the many different national groups and minority groups and ethnic and language groups to make them all speak Russian. But there was a Communist Party goal to this, not simply a national goal, right? Yeah. So how would the Chinese Communist Party be doing this, and why is it in their interest to wipe out these different cultures, and in favor of which culture in China?
Yeah, actually, in favor of no culture except the Chinese Communist culture. If you look at the Soviet Union, and I always think, our whole generation in elementary school, high school, and college are missing the most important lesson from the 20th century, which is the rise and fall or continue of communism. And communism, the idea of culture, I would call that cultural chauvinism, actually came from the West, came from us. If you look at the Western progressive ideas, I'm not sure how many people still remember the term, Darwinism and the social Darwinism. I don't know how many people, I ask a lot of young people, have you ever read and heard of social Darwinism? This is what, if anyone remember the Scopes trial, people remember how they won and this, they never remember actually the teaching materials Scopes was using. It was extremely racist and the cultural Darwinism. So one thing we fail to
here in the United States.
Here in the United States, one thing we fail to recognize in our roots and in communist roots, and we share, the cultural chauvinism itself, and the communism actually put that angle, take that angle, and put that in extreme. If you look at the Soviet Union, and I grew up reading Soviet stuff, you have nothing else to read but memorize the entire Soviet textbook and something. They always, the culturally, now we are going another extreme. We talk about cultural relativism, but in that time when I grow up, it's always teach cultural chauvinism. Who's backward? Well, sometimes I wonder, do people understand progressivism? At some point, it's extremely I can't say brutal, but it's chauvinist. So the Russian, when the Russian empire was built, in the early 1920s, they determined to wipe out all the minorities because they have the minorities, including some Russian groups like the Cossacks in Don River area, where Gorbachev's family came from. They're too independent. If you have cultural independence, if you have personality independence or religious independence, it's very difficult to make them completely submit to the communist rule. So the Communist Party actually in China. Yeah. So
it's really a conformity with what the Chinese Communist Party central leadership requires. It's just everybody to submit or everybody to conform for the purpose of a unitary state that the Communist Party could more easily control. Is that the purpose behind what we're seeing now with the Uyghur repression, genocide, and then the Tibetans earlier, and now the Inner Mongolians and the Cantonese, of course?
Exactly. You can have another leader, other than Xi Jinping. If you worship Dalai Lama, if you think Allah Akbar, if you think in that route, well, the communists will go after you. So what we see is not today. It's the Chinese communists combined tradition, brutality, and the modern technology. This is something, I think the United States needs to be really worried about it, and we really need to pay attention about it. And on the one hand, the traditional brutality is to take you away, put you in concentration camps, separate the family, force sterilization, whatever horrible things the communists has been doing for ages. On the other hand, they also have this facial recognition and AI technology. In China, you can't go anywhere. They even have facial recognition technology under a face under mask.
Wow. And this goes all with their social credit system.
Exactly. And they can openly discriminate against a group, say the minorities, Tibetan, Uyghur. I actually, a friend of mine used to, I forgot to prepare it for today. Otherwise I can show everybody. That's an official notice to the hotel. Said if his Uyghur or Tibetan, or you cannot take them in. The guy had no place to sleep. That's his problem.
So this is also then, they can employ facial recognition technology with the different facial features that are typical of various ethnic groups, right? So they can even if they don't have your electronic signature, they can tell by your face if you're a Uyghur, right, or a Tibetan.
Exactly. And also now the technology goes further, that if you look at the news is they can recognize you from the way you walk. They have no place to hide. Even you have some sort of a face get done and something. The way you can't change your way of walking without special effort.
So Communist China now has become a high-tech racist state, meaning that the very regime has policies to stomp out other races and ethnicities, but they're using Silicon Valley technology and who knows, Facebook or whoever else it might be, to help them develop these technologies for their own repression that can lead up to genocide. Is that how you would say it, or do you?
Actually, the first thing you see is the culture genocide. They wipe out your culture first by wiping out your language, your written language, and change your speaking language. Well, that has been ongoing for a while. And in the 20 years ago, I actually helped some people to establish a school in Sichuan. Can't do that in Tibet, but to adopt few, children, not young people who wants to learn the right traditional writing and reading Tibetan. And since school are not really teaching them that, if they teach that, it's very rudimentary. And so they need a place to learn. It's very hard to find teachers. And in Mongolia, if you look at what happened, is that a few months ago, there was huge demonstration in Inner Mongolia because the Chinese tried to ban the Mongolian language teaching. And while Tibet, we know it has been ongoing for a long time, and it's happening in Hong Kong. What we see, it's happening among all this so-called minority group. And if you think of China, I'm Han Chinese. So let me put this way. I think my culture has been wiped out a great deal as well. As Han people, the traditional culture, the communists anywhere, this is something, they are racist. That's not question, but also they are well, they're not traditionalist. Wherever the communist goes, they would wipe out your traditional culture because that's different from communism. If we don't learn that lesson from the 20th century, well, we will fail again. And coming to think of it,
So
it's
Sasha, tell me why do you see, looking at it now from a bigger geopolitical issue, where you have had these predominantly Muslim countries in the past, especially after 9/11, attacking the United States, at least diplomatically, for being anti-Muslim. Why aren't they speaking out against the repression, singling out the Muslim minority for wide-scale repression and genocide? I haven't heard anybody complain about it.
That's a issue, and a lot of, well, ignoring the Muslim countries. Think of it. They first, of course, everybody was talking about how China make allied with them and all those countries and give them money or do business with them. That's, of course, it's a very obvious reason. But also, we have to recognize all this, if not all, at least most of these countries are non-democratic. And when it comes to that issue, if a conflict between the Western value and an undemocratic value, and we can guess who they sign with. So our value, pluralism, tolerance, and all that, I think a lot of Muslim countries, I'm not going to name some names, I saw reports on that, they secretly admire China's way to suppress Muslims. Why? Because, that's a great model to suppress their own people. And in a way, I'm thinking, dictators love dictators. If they don't love each other, even they fight each other, they identify each other in their ideology. And that is something, we as a democratic country, we have to recognize it as well.
Yeah, that's some trait that we've been looking at, especially over the past year with the Center for Security Policy. We had the COVID-19, or we call it the Wuhan virus propaganda line, to track how it has developed since the epidemic became a pandemic. And you see, part of the brand of the Chinese regime is that our system is superior. It's more efficient. We take care of our problems better. We're more cooperative with the rest of the world. And you're finding that starting to resonate in other parts of the world. So where you're saying now certain of these Muslim dominant countries that are autocracies may be wanting to import a Chinese model of high-tech repression and high-tech governance?
It's not only them, we are falling in that trap as well. And I actually gave a speech in the very beginning of the pandemic, I think it's April 2020. This is a problem. The Chinese gave us the virus, and there's no question. Some people try to switch the argument of whether or not it's man-made. That's not the issue. The issue is that actually they spread the virus to us. And not only that, more importantly, they also gave us the model how to handle the virus. From the very beginning, the Chinese created this dictatorship, the authoritarian model, to uniformly ask people to do this, like lockdown and a mask or whatever. All these ways of restraining people's freedom, and all the ways to automize the society. So we have family, friends now. Well, no, the Chinese, the Communist Party, remember that the model of the rule is always to automize the society. And we are adopting that model. What we do, what they do in Xinjiang, same thing to the Uyghur people. Automize people, separate family, put them in labor camp, and everybody's loyalty goes towards one direction, which is the government, that sort of thing. And I am very worried about, on the surface, with China's so-called success and with all this economic development, a lot of our people are looking into that model and think that's a better model as well. I'm very worried about it. And as a political dissident and former political prisoner from China, and well, I can speak for days to talk about how horrible that model is. And I feel so sad that the United States, a lot of people in the United States fall into that trap.
So do you think this idea of the health passports that would be put on our cell phones, for example, that some airlines might want, or customs services might want, or state authorities or whatever, we saw this first developing in communist China through Western technology or technology they have. But do you think that China is trying to popularize this model internationally for reasons of its own? How does it, for its data keeping, or for to popularize its form of governance that you could then use technology for mass repression and surveillance purposes? What do you see the dangers of this kind of technology being?
Well, we read all of this in 1984, right? So we put 1984 times 100 times, that's what's happening. And for say, if you have a flu shot or COVID-19, well, whatever vaccine shot, you carry a small thing, say, I have that shot, it's okay. But if that code includes everything of your personal information, I have a problem of that. If that thing identified where you live and where you go, which place you have stopped and who you talk to, and all this personal information, I think that is a stone paved, that all stones paved to hell. And we have to resist that. We have to, I'm not that left, I'm not that right, I'm a very civil liberty kind of people. And I live under dictatorship. We have to resist that. The temptation is very easy. Oh, well, we got to control the spread. And tell me, with all this, you want to live in a society like China, you want to be traced every move of your life. Later, people can accuse you or whatever, control you. And we Americans are free people. I came to this country for freedom. We should resist that.
Yeah, because you have a great life story, by the way, where it looks like they didn't do very well re-educating you, which I'm glad to see. But you've lived this repression on your own, so you could see it before the digital technology was being used. But can you explain a little of the how the social credit system works for controlling individuals' lives? I mean, we're here to talk about the Uyghurs and their genocide there, but how would this be applied against individuals or against mass groups to wipe out a culture and to monitor everybody and to force people to comply? Because if you look at the way some people in the West are saying, hey, these health passports are great, it's easy. If you don't want a vaccine or you don't wear a mask, you don't care about society, you're just being very selfish. So they kind of shame you into it. And a lot of people think, man, maybe I am being a little bit unreasonable. How do the communists work this way, to take some semi sort of reasonable measure that they really intend to abuse? And how does that end up being used as an instrument to repress everybody?
You see, social credit is just something the government made up. And who's going to credit whom, first thing. And I think in America, we always credit the government if this government has good social credit or political credit, whatever, it's people's country, right? And who's going to credit me? Say, I'm talking to the liberals now. If you say you sleep with a lot of people, that's what in China you get your bad social credit. And who's going to credit you? So, okay, that guy has women problem. Let's say his social credit is better with women, so everybody avoid him. Do you want that happen? And other social credit, if say, I understand now the main issue, especially like in Virginia where I live, do the former convicted criminals have the right to vote and how to restore their vote. You can talk about it, but think of it under that social credit system. And people who already rehabilitated themselves, former criminals, what would happen to them? I think the liberals should be especially concerned of this. And the Uyghur people, see, the Chinese already put a black mark on their social system by putting down Uyghur. And immediately, so
that goes against you in the social credit score, right?
Well, maybe not
So your
social
race or your
credit, but
ethnicity.
the ID itself, it's already said something. And when it's said, and it's easily said, okay, the social credit said this person, they can do it this way. This person just came out of the re-education camp, had been re-educated, so his social credit now is 50, and the next year he'll get 60. He will improve. But think of it, they already marked you as someone who's lack of social credit. And it happens, and look at all the dissidents. I have a lot of dissident friends. They got arrested again and again, and they speak out. They can easily, put down some social credit down there. You know what would happen to you? You have trouble to go on an airplane to travel, buy a ticket, buy a train ticket. Oh, I give you a very funny example. It's funny, it's sad, and it may make you angry. And some Chinese people, China had this WeChat, their version of Twitter. So people speak out on WeChat from time to time. But China also have this payment system. Everybody is using WeChat. You scan a code, you pay, right? And most stores, a lot of stores now don't even take cash. So a friend of mine who said something, repeated something I said on WeChat, and his WeChat account was suspected for a few days. He could not shop because he could not pay, and it makes cash useless. Think about all the social credit. So people said, well, if 10 years ago I want to escape government control, if I have a lot of cash, I can do something. Now, well, they won't take your cash. Your cash became useless.
So it's tied in with your banking information and everything else.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
So this is a forced mass compliance, and you can see some people even in this country who you can see how the digital industry is now deplatforming people, not just from what they can say, but also where can they do their banking, where they can make their electronic transfers. So there's this kind of a overlap here. Let me get back to the Uyghurs for a second, though, since it was this, because Uyghurs are sort of an exhibit of what to expect from China from the future, and what we've also been seeing that the communists do in the past few decades. But this whole issue of Uyghur mass repression and genocide, why did it surface so recently? Was it always there and people started, there was some activism about it, or is it something that Xi Jinping began, or how did people start to become conscious of what's happening to them?
Well, it's as I said, it's intensified in the past few years, and actually, China had, since September 11th, China used under the name of anti-terrorism. China has done a lot, but there's action, there's reaction, right? So the Uyghur people also, begin to go to mosque more and to form more group. So I think it started about 10 years ago that the Chinese began to, implement some state. For example, you see the Uyghur people, the Muslim people have big beard, they force people to shave it off. And they also force women to take off their veil, and just begin with things like that. And that is very insulting. And also they, sometimes they force Uyghurs, force Muslims to eat pork. All this, the actions.
Yeah, so they're sort of getting them to repress themselves, and yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Now, Adam says we have some questions from some of the folks out in the audience there. So, sure. Adam, why don't we get them now and see what people have to what they're interested in.
Yes, indeed. So, is the Biden administration serious about the genocide in China? Can it do business as usual with China on issues like climate change while only voicing mild objections to the persecution of the Uyghurs?
Oh, that's several questions. Mike, you want to get into it first?
Oh, you're the one. I don't. Let's get into it.
Let's talk about this administration. This administration, so far in its China policy, it hasn't changed a great deal of Trump's policy. I think Trump set course of the new China policy, which I'm very happy to go its route. And Trump actually woke up American people to see what kind of adversary we are facing. So at this point, except the trade policy, which the Biden administration announced they're not focusing on it, and other policies, it's more like a continuation of the Trump policy. So whether or not we can work with
the Secretary of State has even said that too, hasn't he?
Yes.
Secretary Blinken has even credited the Trump policy, saying that it has shaped the Biden policy, and it probably threw them way off course.
Yeah, but whether or not we can work with China as normal and ignoring the Uyghur problem, I don't think it's workable. Because when people dig in it more, when the Western people dig in and they look at more, it's not only the Uyghurs, it's Tibetans, and they look at Hong Kong, because Cantonese pay a great deal of attention to the Hong Kong problem. It's similar problems, and the Chinese suppression of all the so-called minority group and wipe out their culture and all this, people will pay great attention. I think if the administration ignore those problems, that will be a big problem for them. At least we will lose the moral high ground. I'm very glad that the Chinese foreign ministry, foreign minister, and the Blinken, they will meet today, and the Hong Kong and the Xinjiang issue are in the agenda. I'm very happy with it.
So there's several questions, so I think it's important to our audience, all along the lines of, did the Uyghurs spark the persecution themselves via terrorist attacks? Are they radical Muslims? Basically, if they're ostensibly Islamists, do they bear responsibility themselves?
No entire nation or entire group of people, more 12 million or 11 million, whatever, should be held responsible for a few people. We know there are Uyghur terrorists that actually Bin Laden scored. There are 4 Uyghurs among Bin Laden scored in Afghanistan. Many Uyghurs went there, I know that. But how do you justify concentration camp and the suppress of the entire nation, dismantle of their culture because of a small group?
Secretary of State Blinken recently said the U.S. plans to confront China over its belligerent behavior and human rights violations by working with U.S. friends and allies. But will this work, since so many states are afraid to confront Beijing?
Well, Mike, you want to take it?
No, it's all for you. Everyone, Beijing's money talks, and so that seems to be the biggest asset that the regime has right now. But let's hear what you have to say on it, though.
Well, that's a saying in Chinese, that the guy is so poor, he only has money. Same thing in China. When we talk about the Chinese government they will say, okay, we have money and we work with you economically, let's make money, but it goes only so far. So I think, a lot of people, I know people from Wall Street argues that we can't afford to lose China as a business partner, whatever. Can we afford to lose moral high ground if we don't work with the human rights and issues? So that would be my question. And I think American policymakers need to make a judgment. The American people should make it.
Do you agree that the CCP be designated as a transnational criminal organization?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because why? This is one thing I don't understand. Why? Look at the Nazis. Did a lot of of course, they are transnational criminal organization. And if you look at CCP, look at all the Communist Party, and look at the people, how many people they killed, how many crimes they committed in the name of communism and by the Communist Party. To me, from very beginning, I think in the 1970s, my friend and we call them feudal fascists. From that time, to me, they're a criminal organization.
Yeah, it makes sense. If you look at their entire behavior, it's that of a high-tech gangster state, and the Communist Party is really the mafia family that keeps all the glue together. And so, if you look at their hacking against our, Office of Personnel Management, they've never been brought into account for that. All of the personal information of anyone who's applied for a political clearance or security clearance in the United States, they've stolen that. They've stolen DNA. They've stolen all these financial crimes and all this other hacking. The whole thing is a criminal racket, and the party, since it's and this is the handy thing about labeling the party, officially designating the Chinese Communist Party as a transnational criminal organization, is because it is strictly controlled from the top down. They could enforce discipline if they wanted to. It's just nobody's making them do it yet.
Why are none of the Muslim countries doing anything to help fellow Muslims in Xinjiang?
Well, I think that's a question to them. Yeah, because I can only guess. But one thing, as I said, they may identify with the communists, may have business deal with them, it may all become elements. But one thing I'm looking at our side is, our media and our scholars actually fail to pay enough attention. And the one thing it's always amazed me is when, if you look at the study, research in the 60s, 70s, 80s, even 90s, Soviet communism was always considered a criminal organization in many ways and considered bad. But I think in many ways, our China study group, our China study community have too much tolerance and excuses for the Chinese Communist governments. That's a problem.
Why is the news media and Biden administration obsessed with human rights violations by nations like Saudi Arabia, but have little or nothing to say about China's grave human rights violations against the Uyghurs, Tibetans, Christians, etc.?
Well, the administration is still new. I just hope they change. And let's see what happened today in the meeting.
So now
I think the meeting will show us whether or not the Biden administration has been bought off or not, because you have divisions within the administration. You have the Secretary of State, who takes a pretty moderate view, but he's continuing what President Trump had started, a big change. You have Samantha Power, former ambassador to the UN under Obama, who's been very human rights oriented. She's been making very strong statements in support of the Uyghurs, which is a worst case scenario for other members of the Biden administration who are profiting from the Communist Party.
This has to be our last questions, but more of a practical one. So what can an average American do besides not buying merchandise from China, which is extremely difficult?
Well, actually, I meant to mention this in the beginning, but now at the end, there's a piece of news. A German scholar whose name is Adrian Zen, we actually tried to invite him to a panel, issued a report on the Chinese forced labor, the Uyghur forced labor and all this, and mentioned Chinese cotton, the Xinjiang cotton, and cotton products. and the Chinese government is, mobilized a few companies to sue him now. So, and practically, actually, we would support people like him to issue more report and let people choose and identify what kind of products came from slave labor. This is slave labor, let's face it, came from slave labor, illegal labor, and all that. Let's help all those scholars and reporters to identify them.
Well, Mike, if you'd like to say some closing words, and I'll have announcements.
Well, sure. Well, we came here to discuss ignoring the Uyghur genocide, and then we've shown that what's happening to the Uyghur nation and the Uyghur people inside China is just a part of something much larger, repressing all ethnic groups, all cultures in China that don't conform to the standards being set by the Chinese Communist Party. And then when we look at the enforcement mechanisms for that, which include slave labor made products that are sold and that we are probably using in our homes, whether we realize it or not, and then how we are inadvertently being contributors to that slave labor problem, but also anything to do with embracing any of these measures that the Chinese Communist Party itself is using to repress its own people. We have people in our own society who are adapting some of those ideas for sort of, quote, health and safety purposes here in America. So we found that being conscious now about what is happening to the Uyghur people is really opening a lot of people's eyes toward a much broader problem that we're all facing around the world. So thanks everybody for being with us. Thank you for following us on our webinar series. We do take note here at the Center for Security Policy of the people who do watch us every week and who subscribe to our feeds and who follow us and who talk about us for better or for worse on social media. We get energized by all of it. So thanks very much for joining us, and look forward to having everybody at the webinar next week. Thanks.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
And just upcoming events, remember these are all Wednesdays at 1 p.m. Next week, March 24th, Veterans in the Fight, Protecting Our Nation's Power Supply After the Collapse of the Texas Electric Grid, with our Director for Infrastructure Security and Marine veteran, Tommy Waller, joined by two other veterans, Ambassador Hank Cooper and Command Sergeant Major Michael Mabey. The following week, March 31st, Where is the Biden administration's Iran policy going? Featuring Doctors David Wormser and Victoria Coates, moderated by Center President Fred Fleitz. And finally, just remember that the Center's important work is only possible because of your generous support. If you do enjoy these programs as much as me, please visit our website at securefreedom.org. Click on the big red donate button in the upper right corner. You can make an instant credit card donation or get information about other methods. So thanks again to our guest, Sasha Gong, and on behalf of Mike Waller, we'll see everyone next Wednesday at 1 p.m. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.